to the truth about Duncan Hines. I'm sure we all have ideas in our head of what Duncan Hines or who Duncan Hines was. I only knew him for cake mixes. And so when I first started learning about him, that's what I expected to learn. I expected to learn about how he had created these cake mixes and how his company had begun. But that is not what I found out at all. The thing that I found out was that one, unlike Betty Crocker, Duncan Hines is a real person, or he was a real person. However, before he became a household name for cake mixes, he was a traveling salesman. As a traveling salesman, he wanted to make sure that he went to places to eat and to sleep that were safe and clean, and he wanted to also pass that knowledge on to other people so that they too could be safe. But let's begin at the beginning. Duncan was born in Bowling Green, Kentucky on March 26 of 1880. He was the son of Edward Ludlow Hines and Elizabeth Cornelia Duncan. Hines' father had been a Confederate soldier, and he had suffered some stomach wounds from which he never fully recovered. His mother had given birth to 5 sons and a daughter, plus 4 other siblings who had died in infancy, which was common at that time. Elizabeth Duncan Hines died of pneumonia at the age of 38. Duncan was 4 years old at the time. Edward, being of poor health, was unable to care for his 6 children, and so he had family members take them in. Duncan and one of his brothers ended up going to their grandparents' house. It was there that Duncan developed his love for good food. Grandma Duncan had amazing culinary skills, and she was very fastidious about cleanliness in the kitchen. Duncan grew up experiencing delicious meals for every meal of the day. One of his favorites was fried bacon and cream gravy with biscuits. In later years, Duncan would insist on real eggs and butter for his baking mixes. So if you bought his baking mixes, you would have to use your own eggs and butter. At the time, the others who had out cake mixes were using powdered eggs in their mixes. Duncan refused to do that. He wanted his cakes to be moist and fluffy, just like Grandma's. At 16, Duncan was completing his primary education, and he was entering into Bowling Green Business University, and this would be in 1896. However, his education was quickly stalled when in 1898 he received news that he was suffering from asthma and he needed to go west for his health. In order to make his move to the west, Duncan sought employment with Wells Fargo Express Company. Years later, he would state that he took the job because John J. Valentine, the company's president at the time, was friends with Edward Hines, his father. But the truth was that Edward had asked his friend to find a position for Duncan. And so Duncan traveled for Wells Fargo, and he was home based out of Albuquerque, New Mexico to begin with. It was in New Mexico that Duncan visited his first restaurant. Now remember, Grandma was an amazing cook. Duncan didn't eat out. So this was his first restaurant experience, and what an experience it was. It really left an impression on him. Fred Harvey's house, which the locals just called Harvey House, had short order fare, and they also had multi-course meals. Their multi-course dinners were 75 cents. However, those are not what Duncan usually ate. Duncan usually ate at the counter where the menu items did not exceed 25 cents. The reasonable price, combined with the $40 a month that he earned from Wells Fargo, allowed him to eat like a king. Hines was impressed with the pristine conditions of Harvey House. He enjoyed the neat, crisp appearance of their staff, the cleanliness of the facility, and of course the deliciousness of the food. Harvey House very much reminded him of Grandma's kitchen, and Hines stated that she would stress absolute cleanliness when handling food. She always kept 2 pots of water on the stove, one for cooking and one for rinsing her hands. He said he never saw her reach for a utensil or anything else without first rinsing her hands. And there's a picture of his grandma there. And so eating at Harvey's house with it as clean as it was really made him feel right at home. While in Albuquerque, Hines had his very own Wild West adventure. He was riding the Railroad Express for Wells Fargo. They had a safe full of currency, and then all at once, the train came to a screeching halt. Duncan knew something was up, and so he quickly moved to the safe. He took all the cash out of the bags, replaced it with paper, and when the robbers rushed in, they grabbed the bags and took off, making a quick getaway, but they never opened the bags, and so they never had discovered the switch. Duncan saved the day with his quick thinking, and for that he received an award, and it is said by family members that that award was something he treasured for the rest of his life. Hines was later transferred to Wyoming, where he had other adventures, like getting lost in a snowstorm. That's not a picture of the snowstorm. Or having to walk, or when he was stuck in the snowstorm, he had to walk all night long. He walked in circles so that he wouldn't get lost, but he had to keep moving, he knew, or he was going to freeze to death. It was in Wyoming, one day in late 1900, that Duncan met a woman who charmed him, Florence Marie Chafin. The couple's romance faced an obstacle, though. Florence's mother did not find Duncan a suitable mate. While she was glad his family was from the South like hers, she did not feel he had an adequate job to provide for his wife. About this time, Duncan set off for Mexico on a task for Wells Fargo. While there, he was offered a job of helping to keep supply lines open. He would make $500 a month. That's quite an increase from the $40 he was making before, and so this is quite the opportunity for him. Duncan decided that he was going to stay, take the job, and build a nest egg for him and Florence. And so, of course, like many couples of the time that were separated, they corresponded through letters. It was in one such letter that Florence let Duncan know that her mother had passed away. And so his obstacle's been removed. But Duncan is a man of integrity, and he still wants to fulfill what her mother wanted from him. And so he stays in Mexico, and he's determined that he's going to build a sizable fortune so that he can take care of Florence the way her mother wanted her to be taken care of. But soon after her mother's passing, her father also passed. Now remember, they're also taking time to mail letters back and forth. So Florence wrote that she was going to go and live in New York to live with her sister and her sister's husband. It was at this news that Duncan decided it was time to leave Mexico and head to New York and marry Florence. Duncan and Florence married in September of 1905, and for whatever reasons, we don't really know, they decided to settle in Chicago, Illinois. Duncan was soon hired by a pioneer of the direct order advertising, the J.T.H. Mitchell Company. It quickly became apparent that Duncan had a knack for providing imaginative advertising for clients. Hines enjoyed being a salesman, and his customers loved him. They considered him a straight shooter, a man who was honest and trustworthy. Somewhere between 1910 and 1914, the company decided to move away from direct mail or advertising and moved into print advertising. Duncan began designing, writing, and producing corporate brochures, as well as books and catalogs for industrial firms. Skills he would later use in his future endeavors. As Hines traveled for work, he began to jot down the names of places he ate, what he had, what it cost, if the place was clean, and if he enjoyed the overall experience. He had this notebook with him, whether he was traveling for work or whether he was traveling just for enjoyment. These records allowed him to return to a good, clean eatery that he had enjoyed when he found himself in that town again for another visit. It also allowed him to recommend safe places to fellow travelers and fellow salesmen. His fellow salesmen reciprocated by sharing the names of good restaurants they had visited with Duncan. Why was Duncan's notebook such a novelty to others who sought recommendations? Because at that time in history, it wasn't uncommon for salesmen to die from food poisoning after eating at a restaurant on the road. This was a time when cars were just becoming popular. This was a time when highways like Route 66 were just being built, or just had finished being built to connect small towns. But while people were traveling and the roads were getting better, the restaurants were not looking so good. Anyone could put up any kind of restaurant, and so they could throw up barbecue shacks, diners, food stands of all types just began popping up along these roads. Unfortunately, the health codes were not what they are today. And many of the eateries popping up were on dusty back roads where the health inspectors didn't go. Even if they did, there were no food safety standards in America at that time. Hines didn't just jot a note in his notebook about the food. He would step into the kitchen and watch how the food was handled, and even look in the trash. He kept meticulous notes on the places he visited. In 1927, Hines left the Mitchell Company and took employment at Rogers & Company. He now also sold creative keychains, fans, erasers, pens, and other specialty promotional items. It was at this time that Hines, who had traveled by train and as a passenger in a car, decided it was time for him to get his own car. In the 1920s, more roads were being paved and more motorists were venturing out. Duncan was on the road most weekdays for business. It was said that by the end of his traveling days, he was traveling 60,000 miles a year for business. And that's a lot in those days. He enjoyed driving around the Midwest with his car full of specialty advertising items. By 1925, he was traveling outside the Midwest. He would travel from Chicago to Buffalo, New York, to Bradford, Pennsylvania, then back to Chicago in just 1 week. Now more than ever, Duncan relied on residents of the towns he visited for restaurant recommendations. Remember, this was a time before there were chains and franchises like we see today. Duncan had to eat, so he would enter a restaurant that appeared to be clean and order something he hoped would not kill him. Sometimes the food lived up to the reputation, other times it did not. Always, Duncan made notes in his journal about the cleanliness, the quality of food, and the service of each establishment. Duncan loved driving and seeing new places. Unlike most salesmen, Duncan wasn't one who wanted to stay home on the weekends. He and Florence would often take weekend road trips together to new destinations. This couple just enjoyed being together. Florence never worried about Duncan traveling for work or insisted on coming along for work trips. She knew that he was not that type of man. He was a man of character and integrity. Duncan and Florence were more than husband and wife. They were best friends. They enjoyed these weekend adventures together, seeing new sights, trying different foods, and staying at hotels or motels. They went on what they referred to as food safaris. Sometimes they would find delicious food. Other times they would be served meat or food that was spoiled from improper refrigeration. Yet, it was served anyway. If a meal wasn't edible, Duncan would simply pay for the meal and leave. Again, a man of integrity. He did not want to end up dead from food poisoning, as many others had. The precise data for the number of food poisonings that I keep mentioning, the precise number for the amount of deaths in the U.S. in the 1920s isn't really available. At that time, the data collection methods were less standardized than we have today, and so of those that reported deaths from food poisoning, in 1920 alone, there were 957, an increase of over 509% from 1910. So in 10 years, the death rate went up 509%, and those are just those that were reported. This is why Hines' keen interest in good restaurants soon became well known. It was not uncommon for people, friends, and strangers alike to ask them where they should eat. Hines would get phone calls saying, I'm headed to Nebraska. Where should I eat? We're going on a honeymoon in Ohio. Where should we stay? Worth mentioning here is also the fact that motels and rooms for rent for the night were also often unclean and unwelcoming. These were also listed in his notebook. While Duncan would change his employers through the years, he remained in sales and on the road. Word of his expertise in finding good eating places and places to stay would continue to spread. In 1935, a Chicago reporter heard about Hines' odd hobby and asked if he could write a piece about him. Duncan decided it wouldn't hurt anything, and so he gave his consent. However, after the piece ran, he found his phone ring constantly with people asking where to eat and where to stay. Duncan's time was being swallowed up by phone conversations and writing responses to letters. He felt that he needed to respond to each and every one. Again, a man who's got integrity, and he didn't want to leave people hanging. Something had to change, though. So he and Florence compiled a list of 167 of the best restaurants they visited in the 30 states they had traveled to. They only included those that always left a favorable impression. Duncan had 1,000 copies of that list he titled Adventures in Good Eating, printed on blue stock paper. He then sent one out in each of his Christmas cards that year. Remember, he was a salesman, and so having 1,000 Christmas cards sent out was about right. It wasn't an excessive amount. However, the plan to eliminate some of his correspondence backfired, as those who received a copy of the list began asking for more to give to friends and family members. Duncan was willing to print more, but he didn't want to go broke covering the demand, so he began to charge $1 per copy. No one seemed to mind paying for this invaluable resource. Remember, this was a very needed resource that no one was providing. As a side note, you may be wondering about those Michelin stars and if they had started yet. The stars began about the same time that Duncan was putting together his list. However, the Michelin stars began across the ocean in France. This is before the internet, right? So Michelin was a French tire company. At the time, there were only about 3,000 cars on the French roads. So the company decided in order to sell more tires, they needed to get more cars on the road. So they began putting out a guidebook where they provided maps, lists of car mechanics, hotels, and petrol stations throughout France. They also included some basic car repair tips. They gave away over 35,000 copies of this booklet. They also began to charge for it, or they also charged for it. It would not be until 1931 that the Michelin stars would be used as a rating system. All right, back to Duncan. Entering 1936, Hines was still receiving an overwhelming number of requests for his list. He is quoted as saying, "We got hundreds of requests for cards from people we had never heard of. It was then that he realized he had done something that hadn't been done before. He had created an unbiased guide to good eating." Now, here's a side note. Duncan would never take anything for his reviews. He would never take anything for putting a restaurant in his recommended list. He didn't take free meals, he didn't take money, he would take nothing. He wanted his books, his information to remain unbiased, and he wanted to maintain his reputation with that. All right, Hines decided to put his knowledge into a book. He could have ignored all the letters and calls, but he felt like he was duty-bound to answer each and every one. But those responses weren't leaving him any time of his own, and so he created Adventures in Good Eating in a book form. His rationale was that there were book critics to tell people what they should read, as well as art and drama critics to advise them what they should see. So why not a book to guide people to good eating, and why not a book by him? Hines sent out a hand-addressed questionnaire to each notable establishment in his notebooks. The questionnaire asked things like times of day of business, the average cost of a breakfast, lunch, or dinner, and if the establishment had air conditioning. About 90% of the restaurants responded. Of those, about half went into the first edition. Hines discovered a book that included all of them would be far too large. He also was planning ahead, with the thought that if the guidebook was successful, as he believed it would be, he would need materials for another edition. Worth noting here is the fact that Duncan never accepted anything for free meals. Okay, I know I mentioned that before, but that's very important that we remember that he would not take anything from these restaurant owners. On June 9th, 1936, Hines ordered 5,000 copies of his 96-page book to be printed by his employer at the time, the Wright Company. Hines sold them for $1 a piece to offset the printing cost. However, though he sold all 5,000 copies that year, he ended up losing money. The next year, he raised the price to $1.50, and it remained at that for the next 25 years. Worth noting here is that Duncan wrote a cautionary note in the book stating that while he made every effort to accurately present information, he did not control the restaurants. The loss of the cook could alter the food, a new owner might result in the restaurant changing in quality, etc. Again, Duncan was acutely aware of maintaining his reputation. Here's a fun fact. Hines was at a restaurant near Boston, Massachusetts that was owned by Ruth and Kenneth Wakefield. Hines raved about the food and the desserts. Duncan found himself visiting the Toll House often. You may not know the name Ruth Wakefield, but you've definitely tried her popular dessert, the Toll House cookie, and that's a picture of the Toll House. In 1939, Hines was asked to stop at a little cafe in Whitman, Kentucky. This cafe was failing financially, and the owner knew that if he could get Duncan Hines' recommendation, that his business would soar. And so he was invited to stop here, and Hines enjoyed it. He wrote that it was a very good place to stop, sizzling steaks, fried chicken, country ham, and hot biscuits. The place was called Sanders Cafe, and was run by a man named Harlan Sanders, who was perfecting his fried chicken recipe of 11 herbs and spices. You likely know him as Colonel Sanders, the man who would go on to found the KFC franchise. Okay, and worth noting here is Duncan gets some of the credit for the KFC franchise because the business was failing, and with his recommendation, business increased, and then Colonel Sanders, as we know him, had perfected that recipe, and his business took off to be what it is today. These are just two examples how a good review from Hines could affect the popularity of your business. In 1937, with the book's popularity, came thousands of recommendations for Hines to check out. He soon found the task to be too much for one man. He asked some of his friends, who were of like mind, about being good, about getting into the good eating hobby with him. And so they called these guys the Diner Detectives, and they were going to help him cover some of these establishments that were writing asking him to come. One of the places that the Diner Detectives visited and rated for Duncan is this one, which I think many of you will recognize. Duncan, this was possibly even a restaurant that you visited. If you can't see the slide, it's the White Fence Farm. So another business that we know that was influenced by Hines. Sadly, Duncan would lose his beloved Florence in September of 1938. She died of cancer, which as a Christian Scientist she had refused treatment for. She and Duncan had spent her final year traveling and enjoying eating at a variety of places. And you'll see on the side that he also had married Emily Tillman, and she quickly was disappointed to learn that while he was basically celebrity status, he wasn't living quite the glamorous life that she wanted to be a part of. And so she divorced him, and then in 1947, he married Clara Wright Nam, and that's Clara there in the picture. She looks very similar to Florence. Clara and Duncan traveled extensively together. And then Clara and Duncan and their partners. So Duncan and Florence and Clara, and I can't remember her husband's name, they would play cards together. And so they already had known each other for years. And then Florence died and her husband died. And so friends said, you guys should get married. And so that is exactly what they did. All right, so in 1938, Hines published a travel guide for best places to stay. He called it Lodging for a Night, a guide to 3,000 superior motels and hotels within the continental U.S. Hines' new guide was a big hit among travelers. It was also in 1938 that Hines' publication, their needs had grown and the right company could no longer meet them. And so Hines turned to this company that we're very familiar with. He turned to R&R Donnelly & Sons Company, one of the largest in the industry at that time. Hines would continue with Donnelly's until the 1940s, when a move out of Chicago made doing business with them difficult. Hines continued to have newspaper and magazine articles mention him. He also had radio stations tell his story. It was after being featured in the Saturday Evening Post in December of 1938 that Hines' public influence exploded. He became something of a celebrity. He was invited to do radio programs, speak at conventions, and be on TV shows. One that you may have heard of is To Tell the Truth, where panelists had to guess who the real Duncan Hines was. And if you want to see that clip, you can go on YouTube and just put in To Tell the Truth, Duncan Hines, and you can see the clip where he's involved in that. In 1938, Hines moved back to Bowling Green. After setting up new offices, Hines decided to add cookbooks to his publications. This is something he had had many requests for. People wanted to recreate their favorite restaurant dishes at home. Hines was not sure the restaurants would willingly share their recipes, but he decided it was worth asking. He was surprised at the response. His cookbook also included some of his grandmother's recipes for the dishes Duncan had enjoyed as a child. He also asked co-workers and friends for recipes. The book contained 460 recipes, many of which were first tested in his sister's kitchen by Duncan and his sister. The book was published in October of 1939, and 15,000 copies were quickly sold. In 1940, Hines began to take action to clean up America's restaurants. Hines used his influence to reform the restaurant industry, especially in the area of sanitation. He told Americans that they should demand restaurants clean up or close up. By 1941, he had attended several conventions organized by the National Restaurant Association. He was often asked to speak and never missed a chance to offer suggestions for improvements. He also reshaped the mindset about eating out, changing it from eating as a form of necessity while on the road to eating as a form of entertainment. Duncan's approval had become a gold standard for eating and sleeping establishments. Businesses endorsed by Duncan could rent for $10 a year a metal sign that stated, "Recommended by Duncan Hines." They could place this in their windows or out in front of their establishment to draw passerbys in to their business. Those who rented the signs saw financial gain for their businesses. Duncan rented the signs rather than selling them because he wanted to have the ability to reclaim them if the standards of that business declined. Again, maintaining his reputation. He doesn't want his name on something that is not clean and is not well run. You can see this is kind of blurry, but it says, "Welcome to Adventures in Good Eating." And that's not one of Duncan's signs. That's how big it was to have his name. And so this place is trying to link themselves to Duncan Hines. After Hines was mentioned in Reader's Digest, even more Americans were aware that the recommendation from Hines meant a great meal prepared in a well-scrubbed, uncontaminated kitchen. As a side note, some of Hines' pet peeves were chefs or cooks who smoked while cooking, the practice of seating customers at tables that had not been cleaned from the previous diners, pets in the kitchen, and of course the lack of cleanliness. It should also be noted here that Duncan continued his policy of not accepting advertisements or gratuities of any kind for his endorsements. One restaurant offered to pay him $10,000 for a good review, and Hines quickly declined it just as quickly as he would decline a free meal. He wanted his recommendations to remain untainted by bias, and his reputation, he wanted it to remain pristine. And you'll see here he did receive the Good Egg award from the Good Egg Club. So, in September of 1942, the Ohio State Health Commissioners Conference heard Hines state that he thought they should grade restaurants according to cleanliness and require them to post the grade in their front window. He also suggested that restaurant silverware would carry contaminants unless they were thoroughly rinsed in 180-degree water after washing. So he would make a point of these different things that he learned and try to get them to pass them into, to make them rules for the Board of Health. Okay. Hines also pointed out that the State Board of Health visited restaurants maybe once a year, but the penalty for a code violation was $1. And Hines said, this is laughable. We need a better consequence. This $1 is totally ineffective. And so those are just some of the things that he pushed because he so wanted to see a change in the restaurant industry. Sometime in 1943, Duncan established the Duncan Hines Foundation. It gave scholarships to students in hotel and restaurant management schools of Cornell University and Michigan State University. These were some of the best schools at the time for this avenue of study. There's another fun fact. Soon after VJ Day, Publishers Weekly reported that booksellers across the country were receiving numerous requests for Adventures in Eating. Within just a few weeks, over 500,000 copies had sold. By 1945, Adventures in Eating had transformed to an icon of the best of culinary pleasures. Hines appreciated the trust that people placed in him, but was sometimes surprised by some of the questions he received because of it. This is a direct quote from Hines. "It seems ridiculous, but it is true, that I receive a number of letters which do not pertain to my books. For instance, I received a signed blank check from a New Zealander asking me to buy him a 40-acre farm in Kentucky. And I have received many letters requesting me to purchase other things, asking me where they should settle down when they retire, asking me to send them a chef or a hostess. It may sound even more ridiculous, but they even ask me what to name their babies. I receive a number of letters from ex-servicemen and also from Small Business Bureau Washington asking me to advise them in what locality this or that person should locate in order to open up a restaurant, what he should serve, and what he should charge. He responded to the letters mentioned, referring the writer to someone more able to answer their inquiry. But these questions show just how respected Duncan was and how much his opinion and character were trusted. Over the years, Duncan had refused hundreds of requests to endorse products. He had everything he wanted for a comfortable life, and he refused to let his name and reputation be used to promote other products. But then Roy Park entered his life. Roy had held several jobs, but in 1942, he was found buying a business called Agriculture Advertising. Park quickly grew the company enough that he went from 5 employees to 125. In 1945, he was marketing products that included ice cream, milk, grape juice, tomato juice, and canned and frozen vegetables. However, as federal regulations changed and increased, farmers were not happy. They were even less happy when the government began paying farmers not to plant. His clients now had no market for their perishable items. The Grange League Federation asked Park to set up a selling organization that would help them get their items to market. It was now mid-1948. Park first suggested they buy the failing Green Giant Company or the S.S. Pierce Company. Both proved too expensive for the GLF. So GLF and Park decided to look into franchising their own brand, but they needed a logo that would be recognizable and that people would trust. Park assigned the project to Robert Flannery. Flannery and his team began to ask people for suggestions and to research solutions. They discussed many possible names until weeks later when Flannery walked into Park's office and said, "Bring in Duncan Hines." Park wondered why he himself had not thought of Hines. His trusted name and well-known face were exactly what they needed. And there's Park meeting with Hines. Park developed a plan. He believed the first thing to do before meeting a client was to get to know him. So he had researchers learn all they could about Hines by reading every article written about him. Park learned that Hines was not motivated by money. The man firmly believed that you could easily earn $1, but if one lost his reputation, he might never earn it back. After reading all the research, Park was so confident that he knew Hines and knew how to win him over that he prepared completely finished Duncan Hines labels in full color and put them on cans, cartons, and jars so Hines could see his concept. Park set up a meeting with Hines in November of 1948 at the Waldorf Astoria Towers. As Park moved toward Hines, Hines was talking to someone from the Ford Motor Company, clearly turning down their appeal to endorse Ford. Duncan finally told the person that he had once known the Ford, but no more because it shook his liver. Hines, now riled up, turned to Park and said, "I suppose you want to make me rich too through my endorsement." Park quickly stated that he wasn't there to make Hines rich. He was there because he wanted to honor Hines. His proposal was a top-quality food product bearing Hines' name that would influence and change American eating habits. At the end of that first meeting, Park left Hines with product information. At their second meeting, he showed him the products with the Hines labels. Hines and Park reached a 6-month trial agreement. The contract included clauses like, if Hines' reputation was in any way diminished, the contract would be null and void. It also gave Hines complete control over anything bearing his name. However, while Park was trying to win Hines over, the members of the GLF had lost interest. Park sought the advice of a trusted friend. He decided to continue with his plan for Duncan Hines brand. He changed the name of his advertising firm to Hines Park Food, Inc. Over the next 3 years, he hired 50 advertising companies to research, promote, and advertise Hines Park products. Park had one qualification for possible line items. They had to be of the highest quality. He could not afford to lose Duncan's endorsement because of inferior products. Although the company is known today for cake mixes, the first big product for the company was ice cream. Hines kept up his end of the deal, doing radio and print interviews, as well as traveling all over the country, making appearances and promoting ice cream and other products bearing his image. National advertising of the ice cream began in July of 1951. Later that month, the company announced that it would also begin offering cake mixes. It didn't take too long for the cake mixes to take off and become available in more and more grocery stores. In 1953, an aging Hines knew he could not keep up with all of his business ventures. He needed to turn adventures in eating over to someone else. By now, Duncan had learned that he could trust Roy, and he asked him if he would take over adventures in eating. Roy agreed to manage that enterprise for Hines. In 1955, Hines put out a dessert book containing 555 recipes given to him by restaurants, family members, and friends. He also put out a book of his many adventures with food. The first 2 chapters were Hines' autobiography. It was called Duncan Hines' Food Odyssey. Duncan Hines products continued to be popular. The brand added some kitchen appliance to its line, including a coffee maker and ranges. Each item bearing his name had to be approved by him, and he would always check the quality of it. There he's checking the quality of the coffee that would bear his name. In August of 1956, Duncan Hines Institute and Hines Park Incorporated merged with Procter & Gamble. A couple of months earlier, P&G decided to move from soaps and detergents and begin to sell grocery items as well. They purchased Nebraska Consolidated Mills that produced Duncan Hines cake mixes. Roy Park became one of P&G's vice presidents. In this role, he continued to maintain the quality of the products bearing Duncan's name. Park also continued to lead Duncan Hines' print business. Hines himself had little to do with the company after P&G purchased it. By August of 1958, P&G struggled to keep Duncan Hines cake mixes on grocery store shelves because the demand was so great. No one seems to know how Duncan came to be diagnosed with cancer, but in early 1958, he began to show signs of illness. It is said that Duncan never complained and even from his bed would visit with friends and family. On March 15th of 1959, Duncan Hines took his last breath. In November of 1962, members of Duncan Hines' family, that's not his biological family, though he did have nieces and nephews, this is his company family, received a letter from Roy Park sharing the devastating news that there would not be a new 1963 Adventures in Eating, and instructing them as how they could receive a refund for unsold editions, as well as how to return their leased signs, which would no longer be used. Park explained with more highways and tollways that the travel guide was no longer needed in the current times where travelers were had more confidence in establishments and the establishments themselves had new codes to follow. There would no longer be a need for Duncan's travel guide. Duncan is most known today for his cake mixes, but in truth, Duncan was a man who did not cook. Though pictured in many ads pulling items from an oven, he was a man who changed the mindset of Americans to one that looked for and demanded cleanliness and quality in both places to dine and places to eat, or places to dine and places to sleep. A man whose influences and integrity forced a change in the sanitation practices of restaurants. Worth noting is, this is the offices in Bowling Green that Duncan had set up. In Bowling Green, there is a Duncan Hines Festival. There's also a Duncan Hines Road, and there's a Duncan Hines Museum. So if you get out that way, you might want to stop and visit.